Okay, Christine, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your history. I know you came from Michigan originally. You've been on the road for several months. You've been visiting Muslim mosques and various Muslim events around the country. I know that you were in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. back in November, and then you went south. Now you come from a part of the country where there's a lot of Muslims. We don't really have so much around in the Washington state area, eastern Washington, where we're from. So maybe you can just explain to us a little bit about your concerns, what you've experienced. We know you're a Christian, obviously, from the sign, and we're Christians as well. Our main motivation is to present the gospel to Muslims. But a lot of people think we worship the same God, and these are some issues maybe we could talk about. So any thoughts?
Well, I think the main reason why I started is a friend of mine sent an email to me with a story of a mosque in Cleveland, Ohio had put up a billboard stating Jesus is a Muslim. And this is where I first began to have a blood boiling about the Muslim agenda. Putting up such a bold statement that was such a false statement against a Savior that died for me angered me. And so I made the sign. I had it printed up and had it shipped to me. And I went to that mosque who had put up that billboard. And that became my first stand against Islamic agenda. It was totally different from the pride rallies that I had been doing.
Okay.
It was different in a respect. I had to learn a little bit more about Islam.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily a moral issue at this point. It was a religion issue,
Right.
which is a little different than standing at a pride rally where you know they're sinning and they know they're sinning. You just had to expose it. Islam was totally different because
Right.
these are kids and people that were brought up in the tradition of it, and this is all they knew. So standing in front of their mosque with a sign like this started their line of thinking. What are you doing here?
Right.
And that's what started my ministry at a mosque.
Okay. Well, one thought just from what you just said. You know how the Muslims, they often claim, well, we all believe in the same prophets. We believe in, we are all offshoots of the religion of Abraham, and they claim that Noah and Abraham and Jesus are all prophets, that we should all worship the same God. But one of the key issues that comes to my mind is, okay, if Abraham and Noah and Jesus were all Muslims, as the Muslims will claim, why is it that Noah brought pigs on the ark? We know the Muslims just go fit. They go crazy about the swine issue because they believe that's unclean. So how do we wrap our minds around some of these things?
And that's what brought to my awareness that I had to learn about Islam. If I'm going to stand at their mosque, the questions that they gave me were good ones. And there were times where it's like, you know what, I can't answer that, but I'm going to research that. And what made me realize more and more is that their Jesus ascended into heaven, never died on a cross.
Right.
That whole issue of salvation, where my whole faith is wrapped around that cross,
Right.
and what Christ did for me was something they totally eliminated.
Right.
And that right there made it, their Jesus was a different one.
Different Jesus, yeah. And it's interesting because in the Bible it says the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but is the power of God for those of us who are being saved. Yet the Muslims, they do not like the cross at all. So maybe you could explain a little bit more about what do you mean by the Muslim agenda?
I think that began in my mind when I started to stand at the pride rallies and I seen the perversion. I lived a sheltered life. I never seen what went on at those pride rallies. It totally shocked me to see the nakedness, the lewdness, and I'm thinking God's judgment is coming on us with that. And then the Islamic thing came up in my life and I started to realize, is there the possibility that God will repeat what he did to the Israelites back in the Old Testament when they disobeyed God and they went and they did these abominable things, that he sent their enemies to them, and that's why we're working with the Islamic agenda. It's going to be our downfall.
Right.
And I think that's why that Muslims are here. They're going to be our judgment. When it comes time for the Lord to send judgment upon the United States for how we have strayed from his word, judgment is going to be carried out by the Islamic agenda.
Right, I can see how you could look that way.
That's how I feel.
It makes a lot of sense for sure, because we see that pattern in the Old Testament. There's another way of looking at it, which I can see that you're actually performing this as a field of evangelism as well, because even though they are a threat to our society, at the same time they're people who Jesus Christ shed his blood for.
Absolutely.
So we have to look at them as also a mission field.
Absolutely. These are souls.
Right.
And
so
they're a beautiful people.
Right, so it's kind of a paradoxical thing we're dealing with. They are a threat to our society, and they're a threat to our religion, yet at the same time, Christ shed his blood for them.
Yes, and they have to know about this Christ.
Right.
And
right,
that's why when I stand at a mosque with a sign that says, I serve a risen Savior, I do, I didn't say they do, I do, and that Muhammad is dead, they cannot agree to disagree on the sign. They argue over the sign, thinking, is it offensive? No, it's not. She's speaking the truth.
Yeah.
But it's the way it's worded. My Savior trumps your Muhammad. And that's where I show the difference. It's not because Jesus is alive and in heaven and Muhammad has got his bones in Medina. No, it's a spiritual aspect. My Savior came for a reason, to die on a cross, and he beat the power of death by his resurrection. And I says, Muhammad never could do that.
Another thought that comes to mind is back about the same time that you spoke up in the National Cathedral about Islam, there was a gal in Germany that did the same thing in a large cathedral.
Heidi Moon.
Heidi
Yes.
Moon, yeah. And so I find it interesting that, I believe God uses certain people for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because you're a woman, speaking out against Islam makes a very powerful statement.
Mm-hmm.
Because, Islam, usually women are not treated very well in the world of Islam.
Right.
They're kind of a lower caste. You keep them covered up. You either have a hijab, a niqab, or a burqa. In Saudi Arabia and different places, they can't drive cars. They can't vote. If they get raped, their testimony doesn't amount to anything in court. So what are your thoughts on the fact that you happen to be a woman doing what you're doing?
There's something that I have noticed while standing with the sign is I don't seem to get a negative response for being a woman. It's almost like being the woman, having the softer side of the ministry, of telling them I love them, of telling them I care about them, comes from that mothering aspect. And maybe that's an edge that I have, where I have been attacked, but most of the time I'm not. They're there wondering, what is this woman doing there? If I was a man standing with the sign, I believe I would have a different argument. I would have, now don't get me wrong, I do get some that are very mean and nasty.
Yeah.
But if I was a man, it would be a little stronger against me. But I've had it where I've had a group of young teenagers, men, boys, and the older man would come up and says, you show respect to her. She is a woman. So in that respect, I get a little bit more of an edge than if I was a male standing here.
That's interesting.
And that I do find intriguing.
Yeah. There's another thing that comes to my mind is how one of the reasons Muslims have such a hard time with women stems from something that happened in a little Jewish community not too far from Medina. Muhammad and his clan raided a Jewish community called Khaybar, and when they did, they killed most of the men, and they sold many of the people into slavery. And it just so happens that Muhammad was fed a meal by a woman who Muhammad had killed her husband and many of her members of her family. She fed his clan a meal. One of his comrades died from the poison that she put in the meal, and later Muhammad died, I think about 4 years later, and many scholars believe it's because of the after effects of the toxins, whatever poison it was that she used. She was trying to kill Muhammad, see? And her idea was, if he's a prophet, it's not going to hurt him. Right?
And I think with them seeing a woman standing alone, most of the time I'm by myself, they see me as an anomaly, and that's just weird.
Yeah.
We don't see a woman doing that.
Well,
and I think sometimes my strength and my courage to just be able to stand there gives me a little edge of respect, because they don't teach their women to stand up and be bold. Their women are oppressed. And many times, in fact most of the time, I do not get the women to come and talk to me. if there is a Muslim woman coming to talk to me, a man is usually with her. But I can talk to a woman very openly if they do, because of the sexual culture. I can talk to a woman. But it's amazing how most married Muslims cannot speak to an unmarried woman. Will have the freedom, they do it anyway. It's like, because why is she here?
A little hypocrisy.
And I really open up a door there when I say, you know what? You have to have some respect for me, because you're not supposed to be able to talk to me.
Okay, one of the concerns that a lot of people have has to do with Muslim law or Sharia law. And basically what that amounts to is, in Islam, they believe that all law has to come from the Quran. But the problem is the Quran doesn't address everything. So as a result of that, they come up with what they call the hadith, which is kind of an extra biblical or extra Quranical set of literature or rules. And in the midst of all of that, it's a whole civic set of rules and laws. And Muslims don't really believe that they are to submit to any civic laws if it's not Muslim law. So when they come to a culture like Western culture of the United States, ultimately their goal is to replace our laws with their laws. And we even see that in Seattle just recently. The mayor of Seattle was trying to work with some of the local Muslims and some of the local bankers to make it possible for Sharia banking. And of course the reason for Sharia banking is Muslims don't believe in charging interest. Of course the banks have other ways of making their money, so they're going to make their money, so it's just that they don't do it through interest. Okay, so that's one of our concerns in America, is we do not want Islam in places of authority, because eventually they can manipulate us through Sharia law. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I took such a stand at Texas Muslim Capital Day. What are the Muslims doing at the Texas Capitol other than they are slowly incrementing their Sharia law, because they know that American Constitution does not affect them. They are above that. And they don't need to adhere it. They do in some sense of the word. They adhere to it as a citizen. But their main goal is to directly conquer that and set in their own set of rules based on the Quran. There's the agenda of, we're going to infiltrate and we're going to get our people inside the Capitol as congressmen or as statesmen, and we will slowly enforce our laws. And it's already a movement in a lot of the littler places, taking out bacon off a Burger King Whopper. I mean, making that halal food. We don't want that, so we can't have that. And nobody says anything.
Well, a lot of Americans are pretty naive about this halal thing. They don't realize that when there becomes enough Muslims in a school system, eventually the Muslims try to put pressure on the school district so that they would be provided with halal diet, which means no pork, and there's a lot of other things. It's similar to a Jewish diet, but the Jews don't lay this kind of trip on us. They just figure, well, we're here, then we have to provide for our own dietary system. They're not going to coerce or try to put pressure on society. But what the Muslims do is they try to change the laws in the dietary system of even the school system. And then along with that, they are working to change the textbooks about history of Islam and the conflict between the West and the Muslim world, to kind of diffuse any criticism of Islam. And so in order to do that, they have to change the textbooks. If you really look at what's going on in the Middle East today, that's a perfect picture of what has gone on throughout history with Islam. They've conquered with the sword. Nothing has really changed.
And this is how a community does not change over into Sharia law by a dozen Muslims. It comes with the majority of the community now being Muslim. Dearborn, Michigan is a perfect example of this, where most of the stores are in Arabic, because the majority of the population has pushed the white person out and has brought in the Muslim.